The cold wind howled as Jenna locked up the small thrift store for the night. It had been a slow day, just a few customers browsing the aisles, searching for hidden treasures among the racks of second-hand clothes and old books. She pulled her coat tighter around her and glanced at the pile of returned items left at the counter, waiting to be sorted. One particular coat caught her eye, a heavy woolen jacket that looked far too nice to have been donated. Something about it felt different, almost personal. With a sigh, she picked it up and ran her fingers over the worn fabric. It smelled faintly of cologne, mixed with something else, maybe thyme. As she went to check the pockets, something crinkled beneath her touch. Frowning, she reached inside and pulled out a folded, yellowed envelope. The paper was soft, aged, as if it had been waiting for years to be found. Her heart quickened. The envelope had no postage, no return address, just a name written in neat, careful script. Jenna hesitated. Who had left this coat behind? And more importantly, had they ever meant to lose this letter? Curiosity got the best of her. She carefully unfolded the fragile paper, eyes scanning the words written in ink that had slightly faded, but still held the weight of deep emotion. It was a love letter. A long, heartfelt message filled with memories, apologies, and a desperate hope for a second chance. Jenna's throat tightened as she read. Whoever had written this had poured their soul into every line. But there was something else, something unfinished. The letter was never delivered. Her mind raced. How long had this been tucked away? Months? Years? Decades? And what if the person it was meant for had been waiting all this time, never knowing? Jenna looked back at the coat as if it might whisper its secrets to her. Whoever had donated it might not even realize what they'd given away. And yet, this letter, it was too important to be forgotten. A decision formed in her mind. She had to find out who this belonged to. She had to know if it was too late, or if, by some miracle, there was still a chance for the words on this page to change someone's life. She glanced at the clock. The store was empty. The night was quiet, but her heart was anything but still. Somewhere out there, two lives had once been connected by these words. And maybe, just maybe, she was holding the key to bringing them back together. But first, she had to find out who had lost this letter. And that was where everything would begin. Jenna sat at the counter, the letter still in her hands, her mind racing with questions. Who wrote it? Who was it meant for? And how had it ended up in the pocket of a coat that had been tossed into a donation bin like an afterthought? She turned the envelope over, hoping for a clue, an address, a date, anything. But there was nothing except the neatly written name, Margaret. The name rolled through her thoughts like an unsolved puzzle. It felt old-fashioned, like it belonged to a different time. Maybe the letter had been written decades ago. Maybe the person who wrote it had long since moved on. Or worse, maybe they never got the chance to say what they needed to say. Jenna let out a slow breath. She couldn't just ignore it. The words inside were too raw, too filled with longing to be left unread and forgotten. But how was she supposed to find the owner of a letter? With nothing but a first name, she reached for her phone and scrolled through the store's records. People donated clothes all the time, dropping off bags without a second thought. But returns were different. They were processed, logged. There had to be a way to track down who had brought this coat back. And then she found it. The return had been made just 2 days ago by an older man, a Mr. William Carter. The name didn't ring any bells, but the small note in the system caught her attention. Returned after family donation mix-up. Jenna's pulse quickened. Maybe he hadn't meant to give up this coat at all. Maybe the letter inside was a part of something much bigger. The next morning, she decided to find out. The address listed in the records led her to a quiet neighborhood just outside of town. The houses were older, well-loved, the kind of place where people had lived for years, without much changing. She knocked on the door, heart thudding. After a moment, it opened, and a man in his 70s peered out. His hair was grey, his face lined with time, but his eyes were sharp, studying her with quiet curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked. Jenna hesitated for only a second before holding up the letter. "Mr. Carter, I think this might belong to you." His gaze dropped to the paper in her hands, and in an instant, his entire expression changed. His fingers tightened on the door frame, his breath catching in his throat. Where did you get this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "It was in the pocket of a coat that was returned to my store." Jenna explained gently. "I wasn't sure if you meant to give it away." For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at the letter like it was something from a dream, something impossible. Then, with a shaky breath, he stepped aside. "You should come in." Jenna followed him into the house, her curiosity growing with every step. The home was filled with old photographs, memories frozen in time. She saw pictures of a younger William, smiling beside a woman with soft curls and bright eyes. Margaret, she knew it before he even said her name. "She was the love of my life," William murmured, his eyes lingering on a framed photo on the mantel. "But I never sent that letter." Jenna swallowed. "Why not?" He let out a soft, sad laugh. "Fear, I suppose. Stubbornness. We had an argument, a big one. I wrote that letter, hoping it would fix things, but I couldn't bring myself to send it. And then, life got in the way." Jenna's chest ached at the weight of his words. "And now," she asked carefully, "do you know where she is?" William hesitated. Then he nodded. "She's still in town. We haven't spoken in years." His voice was thick with regret. "I thought she had moved on, until my son accidentally donated that coat. I found out too late, and when I realized what had been in the pocket," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I thought it was gone forever." Jenna held out the letter. "It's not." For a long moment, he just looked at it. Then with a trembling hand, he took it from her grasp. His fingers brushed over the paper like it was something fragile, something sacred. "You kept it all these years," Jenna said softly. "Maybe that means something." William exhaled, his grip tightening on the letter. "Maybe it does." The air between them felt heavy, with unspoken possibilities. Jenna didn't know what he would do next, but as she stepped back out into the cold morning air, she had a feeling the story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. William sat in his quiet living room, long after Jenna had left, the letter resting in his hands. He had spent years convincing himself that some things were better left in the past, that time had built too many walls between him and Margaret. But now, holding the words he had once been too afraid to send, he couldn't ignore the truth. He had never stopped thinking about her, never stopped wondering what might have been. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the letter and read his own words, written so long ago. The apology, the longing, the hope that maybe, just maybe, she would forgive him. He had written it with every intention of fixing what had been broken, but instead, he had let silence fill the space where love once lived. He glanced at the old rotary phone on the table. It felt impossible. After all these years, what could he even say? Would she remember? Would she even want to hear from him? But then he thought about the way Jenna had looked at him. The way she had placed the letter in his hands, like it still mattered. Maybe it did. Maybe it always had. Before he could talk himself out of it, he picked up the phone and dialed the number he still knew by heart. It rang once, twice. His heart pounded. And then, hello. The voice was soft, familiar, like a melody he hadn't heard in years. His breath caught. Margaret. It's William. A pause, then a quiet inhale. William. He could hear the surprise in her tone. The years stretching between them. But there was something else too. Something that gave him hope. I found something. That belongs to you, he said carefully. Something I should have given you a long time ago. Another pause, then a soft chuckle. I was wondering when you'd finally call me. His grip on the phone tightened. You were? Yes, she said, her voice warm with something close to amusement. It only took you a few decades. He let out a breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Margaret, Come, see me, William, she interrupted gently. If you still have that letter, I'd like to read it, for the first time in a long time. William felt something shift inside him. A door that had been closed for years was suddenly open just a crack, and all he had to do was step through it. Later that afternoon, William stood on Margaret's front porch, the letter clutched tightly in his hands. The house hadn't changed much, though time had softened the paint and worn the wooden steps. His pulse pounded as he lifted his hand to knock. But before he could, the door creaked open, and there she was. Margaret. Her hair was streaked with silver now, but her eyes, those same warm knowing eyes, held the same light he remembered. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the years melting away between them. Finally she smiled. Well, she said softly, let's see what you've been carrying around all these years. William exhaled and held out the letter, and as Margaret took it, their fingers brushed. Just for a second, but long enough to remind him that some things were never truly lost.